Interview questions for the genetic basis of offending. Question 1. Is it true that the genes with which we are born determine everything that we do in our lives? Genes are one of the main building blocks when it comes to the traits that are passed down from the parents to the children, from the genetics and to their behavioral dispositions. Genes are situated in large network owing to the various interactions taking place between cells, and when they're combined with protein synthesis, it results in a genetic profile that's very unique to the child. Such genetic profile might make the child more prone to inherit certain diseases as well, such as diabetes. However, genes simply act as loose guidelines with which the child will operate. Usually, biologists use a heritability estimate that can assess how much genetics actually influence behavior. Rather than giving scientists a picture of how genes influence their future behavior, it studies gene in specific environmental context. So if a child has the propensity to be diabetic and they live in poverty, they are likely to get that inherited disease because there's minimal access to fresh produce while also having a lifestyle that's sedentary. Therefore, I would ascertain that genes act in limitation. There is only so much that they can do. But when we factor in the environment the child is placed in, we can truly understand the true influence of genetics. So, the gap between the genotype of a child and the lived experiences is filled by the environment, and that it influences for them to act in certain way. For instance, if a child has been genetically predisposed to have antisocial attitudes but is raised in an environment that teaches them how to be gentle, calm, and reflective about their experiences, the chances of them actually developing the antisocial attitudes decrease significantly. In conclusion, I would say that those children who are at a high risk for developing a disease or a disorder will benefit the most by placing them in an environment that is safe and healthy to reduce the influence of genetics. So genes that we have inherited will just become something whose effects might be mitigated with the proper environment. Question 2. Are all people born with the warrior gene or MAOA gene are going to be violent towards others at some point in their lives? Since the MAOA gene or the warrior gene has been discovered, lawyers have been using low levels of this gene and they're linking it to an increased risk of violence. The MAOA gene, monoamine oxidase A, is a gene that is linked to the X chromosome. The MAOA genes works by breaking down neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. There have been some instances where the MAOA gene's low activity has led to antisocial behavior and an increased chance of being a gang member. While it is easy to blame this particular gene, we also need to examine how environmental risk factors can worsen the situation or act as a protective factor. Through the Dundin case study, we can understand the interplay of genetic factors, namely low MAOA levels, with environmental factors. The study showed that a small percentage of men who were mistreated in childhood made up a major chunk of people who had engaged in violent or antisocial behavior. About 85% of the population studied with the environmental and genetic marker developed antisocial behavior. Participants who were not subject to mistreatment did not develop antisocial tendencies. Lastly, in the participants who had high levels of the MAOA gene were subject to mistreatment, the gene actually acted like a protective factor. Looking at the evidence, I can say that genetics do not act as a rigid framework. If it were the case, then every person with a low MAOA gene would turn out to have antisocial behavioral tendencies. Additionally, people with the warrior gene would be the ones committing violent crimes exclusively, but that is not the case. Environmental factors also have an important role to play when it comes to real life applications of genes. Only relying on a particular gene, and fear mongering amongst the public is a gross oversimplification of how this gene and the environment act with each other. Question 3. How much of offending behavior is caused by nature and how much by nurture? Genes by themselves do not cause a singular type of behavior. It is also noteworthy that genes predispose individuals with specific traits and tendencies to act in a certain manner. Specific events and experiences help mold a person's perception of the social world. A person's environment directly influences their idea of what it means to be a criminal. In response, their expression of violence and crime gets altered. Newly developed concepts related to crime and violence might turn vague ideas into practical traits. This has an impact on how a person perceives the real world and their ability to make rational choices. One of the main drivers of change is the selection of peers. As a child develops into an adult, they are more selective of the people that they surround themselves with, and they might also be critical of their relationship with their family. Growing up in a hostile environment with peers who steal and abuse drugs normalizes delinquent behavior, influencing a person's idea of what it means to be a criminal. On the other hand, genes give limits to which an individual might have a predisposition to learning and engaging in criminal behaviors. Genes set up tendencies where a person is more likely to engage in criminal behavior. However, the environment they grow up in can act both as a protective factor and a risk factor. If an individual has a genetic makeup that makes them vulnerable to antisocial personality, growing up in a house that focuses on healthy communications and honest discussions, the environment might actually be a protective factor. On the other hand, if the same person grows up in a violent and abusive household, the risk of engaging in antisocial acts increases. In other words, the environment simply acts as a key to activate the person's genes that have been passed down by their parents. Question 4. What kind of life experiences makes it more likely that somebody with an inherent propensity for addiction will be addicted to drugs or alcohol? Many people are born with a genetic predisposition to get addicted to drugs or alcohol. However, the environmental factors also influence how an individual with genetic makeup makes them vulnerable to certain addictions. Various instances of gene and environment interactions, like upbringing and choice of peers, influence the expression of this genetic predisposition. Early exposure to adverse life events like trauma, abuse, neglect, and having an unstable family environment can change certain brain structures, while also impairing control, decision-making abilities, and emotional regulations. Other factors like parental neglect and drug abuse and lack of emotional support and warmth can also normalize drug or alcohol abuse for a child, increases the chances of them actually getting addicted to drugs or alcohol as they grow up. Chronic exposure to living in a high crime area, permissive attitudes towards violence, and surrounding them by peers who engage in these actions might also give way to alcohol or drug addiction. Lastly, having easy access to drugs and alcohol and starting young when taking these drugs or substances has an adverse impact on children for a long term. Disorders like anxiety, depression, PTSD, or ADHD increase the risk associated with addiction, since they are more likely to self-medicate. The risk of self-medication increases when these disorders are not officially diagnosed. While many might think that having a genetic predisposition is highly deterministic, it is a false notion. Many people who have the genes responsible for addiction can mitigate its effects by having some protective factors in place, like having a strong connection to their family, high self-esteem, and getting a diagnosis for their mental health challenges. Question 5. If someone is born with a genetic predisposition to break the law, what kind of things can be done to help them to avoid them getting involved in crime? When a person has a genetic makeup that makes them a risk for engaging in criminal behavior, it is not deterministic. Such people have higher chance of committing criminal actions, but in such cases, genetic predisposition can be mitigated with the help of lifestyle changes and living in a controlled environment. Environmental cues that compound on top of genetic tendencies might lead to criminal behavior. To successfully address the effects of these genes, protective factors need to be put in place. Um, when it comes to crime prevention, protective factors such as having good interpersonal relationships, having peers who are encouraging, and a family that is supportive and non-violent can help a child develop good with having self-confidence and good self-image. Doing well in school, having educational attainment, or having a strong attachment to the communities, whether it be spiritual or religious, focuses on self-development can mitigate these risks as well. If there is a family history of mental illness, a child can be diagnosed to prevent the chances of future offending. Proper coping techniques that are not destructive can be taught to children to help them address and manage their inner world. Other factors like poverty, poor socioeconomic status, and substance abuse can be addressed by making the family unit stronger. Thank you.